Innerfire Podcast. We're glad to have you with us today. Today we have Sam Thevanayagam with us, and Sam is a friend that runs a business up in the Northeast, and he was born in a Christian home in Sri Lanka, and his parents set for him an example of faith, teaching him the power of unconditional love. Today, he and his wife, Danilyn, carry on this love with their own 5 children. Sam moved to the U.S. in the early 20s and received a BS degree from Oral Roberts University. He has been a TEDx speaker and an author. He recently has completed the book, The First 10 Runs in Singles, Life Lessons from the Game of Cricket. And it is an outreach tool to help teach about leadership, business, and faith globally. And we're going to have a chance to talk to Sam about that a little bit. Today, we're just going to talk to Sam about the integration of faith, how he integrates his faith into his business, talk about his book, some of his leadership principles. We're just glad to have him with us today. Sam, welcome to the Innerfire Podcast.
It's nice to be here, Scotty, and to be a guest on your show.
Well, we certainly appreciate you taking the time. I know you got a lot on your plate right now. I even had some customers visiting there today, and so we really appreciate you taking the time out to talk with us. And I think it's going to be useful for our listeners just to hear some of the things that you're doing. And so, our listeners are not familiar with you other than the intro that I just gave them. So tell us a little bit about Sam. I'm going to call you Sam T.
Yeah, that's good.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Sam.
Yep. So I was born in the island of Sri Lanka, and I came to this country, when I was 22 years old. So I'm 58 years old now. So I've been in this country for about 36 years. So I was born to Christian parents. My father was a military officer. He served, very well as a military officer and ended up being a major general in the army. My mother was a school teacher. And so they were both very much into service. Profit would have been considered a bad word in my home, right? None of my parents understood what it was to make a profit, But from the time I was a small young boy, I always wanted to wheel and deal, and and so my first job was when I was 18 years old. I didn't quite finish high school. And my father said to me, stop wasting your time and my money, and I think you need to go to work. So he made a couple of phone calls, and I went to work for a company as a commodity broker. And I was a broker for 4 years and, started to do a very good job selling on the rostrum. A rostrum is like a bench, where a judge sits. And so I used to sell at the rostrum. I became pretty good at my job. And, for the first time, I started to get comfortable in what I was doing. And so at that point, I said, I'm good at this. I really would like to do something more with it. But in 1983, when I was 20 years old, there was a bad racial riot in Sri Lanka where there was a lot of people who were in the minority that got their homes destroyed and stuff like that. And my father was in a pivotal position. On one hand, we were a minority, but on the other hand, he was a general in the majority army. And so we were in a very pivotal position. So our house, nothing happened to our house, but what happened during that riot really affected me. And I thought to myself, I wanted more than what I was doing. And so I ended up getting a passport. I went out and did an exam called the TOEFL, which is to be able to proficiency in English as a second language. And I also went to school at night and got a diploma in business, right? And I was fairly good at it. I remember doing terrible in accounting, but in the other classes, I did fairly well, right? And so God put in a desire for me to study, and then I really started to pray and ask God to create a way for me to come to this country, because the finances that my family had, we were upper middle class as far as status is concerned, but we were certainly middle class when it comes to income, right? So there was not too much discretionary income in the family, and so there was no way for my parents to be able to afford for me to go to school. And during that time, I used to go to a life group, or what we would call a cell group in my church. And I always had this unspoken request. Every time they would call for prayer, I would say, I have this unspoken request. And so for a listener that doesn't understand what an unspoken request is, I didn't necessarily verbalize my request, but I was just telling the person who was leading the group that there was something that I was praying about, and the request was something between me and God. And the whole request was, God, I want to go to the US to study. And when I wrote to a lot of universities and I got a lot of rejection letters, or it was very expensive, I started to tell God, God, if only a family from the US can come to Sri Lanka and meet me, they would give me an opportunity to be able to come live with them and go to school. And so that's exactly how God worked it out, right? So there was a couple that came to our church. My parents met them and took them out for a meal just to be nice to people who were visiting. It turned out that they wanted to do something for my family. They asked some questions. The gentleman who was visiting, he was a PhD and a vice president of academic affairs of a community college in Michigan. And when he met me, he said, Sam, I could give you an admission right now. Ended up, I went and lived with them for a year, and they gave me a soft landing, to go to a community college. They promised me 2 years. I was able to my associates in 1 year because I was able to transfer the diploma that I had done in Sri Lanka, over to this community college. And so then I ended up at Oral Roberts University in 1986, and I finished a degree in marketing and then was hired by a company in Philadelphia. So that's kind of a journey right up to how I started work here.
Right. So tell us a little bit about your Christian upbringing in Sri Lanka. A lot of our listeners would not be familiar with what's the status of Christianity in Sri Lanka at the time that you were brought up, and just what did that look like as coming up as a Christian in Sri Lanka?
So I was fortunate to have been born to parents who were Christian. They were very God-fearing. They were pretty devout. We belong to the Anglican Church. Today that church would be called the church, or the Episcopal Church is what it would be known as in the US, right? But when I was about 15 years old, my mother wanted more than what she was getting from the Anglican Church. And because my father was away serving in a different location, she started to go by herself, and eventually, influenced by this charismatic church, we ended up leaving the Anglican Church to go to the charismatic church. That was a somewhat of a traumatic experience, because the Anglican Church saw my parents as being a nucleus as far as being a people of influence and stuff like that. They didn't want us to leave that church, but my mother felt like, that we really, for our family, that, we needed to be more Bible believing, more understanding the charismatic experience and stuff like that, So
Right.
that's how come. And of course we went to Sunday school, and that kind of thing. And so I was brought up around prayer, brought up around worship. I can truly tell you that my parents were extremely, extremely instrumental in enabling me to be, the Christian I am today.
So you left the Anglican Church, started going to a charismatic church when you were roughly 15 or 16. That was a pretty major event from a spiritual standpoint, it sounds like. But you got integrated into that church and was there
Yes.
until you came to the U.S.
Absolutely, and I still have a relationship with the pastor there. We continue to support him and continue to seek advice from him when I do go to Sri Lanka. I visit with his family. So yes, it's been a long-standing relationship with them.
Very good. Very good. So when did you personally come to faith in Christ? Was that during that time, before or after, or what can you tell us about that?
It was probably when I was about 13 years old, that I used to go to a Youth for Christ. And also we had the school that I went to was a Christian Anglican school, and we had a chaplain there who was pretty, he was quite influential in my life as well. I would say between YFC and him, I came to know the Lord when I was about 13 years old at a Youth for Christ rally. But then, I've had a lot of bumps along the road, didn't necessarily always live up to that, but that was my first conversion experience.
Kind of from a cultural standpoint, I mean, you've been in the U.S. long enough now to kind of understand the U.S. church. Give us just a short snippet of what might be different between U.S. and Sri Lanka, and especially as it pertains to once people, if they go to church on Sunday and then they leave out of church, are Sri Lankans more effective at carrying that outside the walls, or do you find the U.S. Christians are more effective, or?
Right. So I would say that, it's a mixed bag, right? Because at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who are nominal Christians, right? Who go to church on a Sunday, or who go to church at Easter or some special days. So you find those types of Christians there as well. But I would say that the Christians in Sri Lanka, because we are a minority, right? Sri Lanka has only about 3 to 4% Christians. When you talk about Protestant Christians, it's less than 6%, right? So we are used to, I was having a conversation with my wife, we are used to being in the minority, being people who've have to make do with a lot that we have been left in our lives, right? And so, I would say that the people of faith there, we have to have faith for a lot of things, right? Even today, Sri Lanka is completely locked down right now because of COVID, because India and Sri Lanka is getting pretty hit hard right now. And my heart really bleeds for the Sri Lankan people, because there is a lot of, unlike in the US where there is a lot of telecommuting and the jobs are, you can continue to work, right? If you look at the US economy, it truly hasn't been affected that much by what has happened. But because we have much more of a service economy, we have a lot more of a financial economy, whereas in countries like Sri Lanka, where things like, there are two things that have really affected Sri Lanka. One is the tourism, because we are an island and we've always had a lot of tourism from all over Europe, number one. And number two, we've also had a very big garment industry, so you will see a lot of clothes made in Sri Lanka, and a lot of those, people have not been able to place those orders like they have, right? And so Sri Lanka is actually going through a very difficult time economically. And so, if you think about it, persecution and hard times does make the church become stronger. I can truly say that my parents, especially my mother, was a real woman of faith. She really lived out her faith. She was about her faith. She was somebody who was extremely consistent in the way that she lived, and so was my father. But my father wasn't as demonstrative, because of being in the military and stuff like that. His faith was more personal. My mother's faith was more transparent, and she was a lot more vocal about who she was and what she believed in.
So did she rub off on you, Sam, or are you more that way, would you say?
I would say that I'm more that way. I truly believe that, God has a lot of opportunity. He has transformed my life. And, I want people to, I'm not ashamed of being a Christian. I want to be known as somebody who is a Christian, flawed maybe, but on the other hand, somebody who is a Christian, who knows Christ, who has been transformed by his grace and his mercy, and somebody who continues to look to him, so that I can finish this race strong.
From what I know about what you're doing in your business, it's obvious to me that you are doing that, that you are transparent, and you're trying to take what we say we believe as Christians and actually implement it, not only in your business but in your community. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, and maybe just tell us what you're doing, because one of the things I find is, you and I both have a common experience of being in C12, and we hear a lot of stuff, but people that don't have that opportunity, don't always understand what businesses can do and what businesses are doing. Which, when I say businesses, what I really mean is Sam, right? Because Sam's you're the one that's driving that and living that out in front of your folks. So just tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how you're trying to impact your business and the community, through your Christian service.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So going back to my mother, she always used to say, to whom much is given, much is also required, right? And that actually talks to the heart of stewardship, doesn't it? Right? She's saying,
Yes.
to whom much is given, much is also required. And then if you go back to the teachings of Jesus, he says, when you do some of these things for the least of these, you're doing it as unto me, right? And so, if you think about it, Jesus and God doesn't need our money. He doesn't need our time. He doesn't need those resources that he's given us. But certainly he has put people in our path. He has put people in a place of where we can actually influence that. And so I have been able to use my company as a vehicle of demonstration, right? So, it's one thing to believe something. It's another thing to be able to live that out. So the vehicle of demonstration that I'm using primarily is my business, right? And so I have been given an opportunity, of my three businesses, one of them is in Philadelphia. So I'm actually talking to you from my operation in Philadelphia. And, we have a lot of immigrants here. We have a lot of people. There's a very diverse community here. And so it has given me an opportunity to love on these people. Many of them don't speak English. Given me the ability to be able to come into their lives and to be able to teach people who don't speak English. This is a great way to assimilate people, into becoming Americans. If you look at Europe, one of the biggest issues in Europe is the fact that the immigrants have not necessarily assimilated into being European,
Yes.
being English or being German, and it has caused a lot of diversity. I understood and spoke English fairly well, right? That was number one. And number two, my Christian faith, right? Because I was a Christian, America 35 years ago, 36 years ago was still a Christian nation. We still have we have still got Judeo-Christian values and principles. So it was very easy for me to make that transition. Some people may not find it that easy, right? So just like how I came and stayed with the family, and that was a soft landing for me to become more of a, it was easier for me to become part of the American experience. I believe my company has given the ability for a lot of first-time immigrants to be able to do that, whether it is, teaching English as a second language, whether it is their experience of buying their first home. One of the things that we have done is we have created something called a hub, Help You Buy, and we give people, a down payment so that they can buy their first home. I read a book called Mystery of Capital, and the author talks about one of the most important transactions that a person can have is to be able to buy their first home, because home ownership is a primary way that all of us create collateral for ourselves. And so recognizing this, I have enabled people to buy their first home. So just last year, we had 17 people be able to buy their first house. We have helped somebody who was incarcerated, be able to have a new life by coming to work for us and giving them pathways to be able to continue to do well in their jobs. So, I would like.
Let me interrupt you right there, Sam. Before we get too far away from it, I want to ask you a question because I think something just came to my mind as you were talking. You're helping. You mentioned you're helping a lot of the immigrants. You talked about assimilating them into the American culture. Talked about your own experience in that. How should we as a church? I mean, this is an issue in the church right now. A lot of conservatives are at least painted as being against immigration, right? And I know there's a big issue down on the Mexican border and all that, but just in general, give us your thoughts on how we as a church should respond to immigration. What should our thinking be on that?
Right. So I'm a firm believer, even though I'm an immigrant, I'm a firm believer in legal immigration, right? So that's number one. You didn't ask me about illegal immigration, but I believe that we are duty bound to figure out a way for people to be able to come and work here, for a wage and be able to go back. So something short of citizenship, they need a worker's visa, something like an H1, where people can come in, for people who are migrant workers who have to come in and work in the fields and different things like that. I think as a country, we need to figure out a way for people to be able to come and be able to work, be able to pay their taxes, and then be able to go back. Many of these people don't necessarily want to become citizens, right?
Right.
So that would be number one. But number two, if you think in terms of a negotiation, so I used to run a purchasing organization, and I spent a lot of time understanding power and negotiations. It usually takes the person who has the power has the ability to create the environment, right? So as conservatives, we may only want to believe in, we may believe, like me, that legal immigration is the right thing for this country. Having said that, there are those who live in our communities, right? There are people who are already here. The example that I will give you is I have a cousin who lives in Ohio, right? And there is a very large, African African community that have come in there, and they are primarily Muslims. My cousin and her husband have figured out a way to break into that community by teaching them English, by teaching them math, helping them with their homework, and again, there is not a whole lot we can do once people are already here, right? As far as saying, well, at some point, we have to come off what we believe and be able to be that vehicle of demonstration, right? And so I would say that it's our responsibility to ask God and His Holy Spirit how He would want us to act within the people that we come into contact with, right? Some of it is just starting a conversation. Some of it is just, being able to open your home, like my American parents did, right? I came to lovingly call them mom and dad, because my mother and father, I call them amma and appa, which is the language, which is what I called, which I continue to call them until they passed. So, there were people who opened their home to me, right? So I don't know exactly. It's not for me to sit here and say this is the right thing to do. But I think, as we partner with God and as we ask the Lord these searching questions, I think He will actually give us tangible ways that we can be salt and light to the people that He has put in our path.
I think that's really good. And I think the key point there is, we can take a position, we all have an opinion, and, I just happen to align with your opinion that, we're not anti-immigration, we're just for legal immigration, not illegal immigration.
Exactly.
But we as a church, I don't want to be down on the American church, but I've seen this sometimes. We really like to argue a position more so than get our hands dirty doing things like you were talking about your relatives doing, as far as getting out, being involved in teaching English, teaching math, helping integrate into the school systems and with homework and those kind of things. And so, I really think, and I mean, this is part of why we're having these conversations, is to help Christians understand that we need to get out and we need to get active. We need to take our faith outside the church into the community. And it's a lot easier to deal with these situations, one-on-one, rather than just kind of standing back and taking a position and not doing anything. And that kind of goes to, you and I had the opportunity to be together in Phoenix and talk about some of these cultural issues that we're facing, talk about how they impact our businesses, talk about how they impact the church. And you said something there that kind of quieted the room, I will say, when you said, we need to stop playing defense and play more offense. A good offense is the best defense. And what you're talking about there is really plays into that, kind of what you were describing with your work. So speak to that comment a little bit more and expound on that, if you would, just as far as what's the difference between being defensive and being offensive in these issues?
Right. So the way I see this is I have embraced, where I am, right? I've heard people say you have to grow where you're planted, right? So this is where God has put me, right? And I just need to make sure that I am relevant, to my community and the culture that is around me, right? And so I have to do my part. And then not only do I have to do my part, I need to help define that, right? It's my responsibility as a leader in the community, as a business person, not to be always defensive about the things that are coming my way. So diversity and inclusion, people who don't speak English, right? That's a diverse population that I am actually able to target because they are in my community. So I have actually a broader definition than even the world might actually say. They may actually want to say diversity and inclusion is based on sex or based on gender or something like that. And I'm saying, who says that is the only way to be able to define it? And so not only do I have a broader definition, number one, number two, I am not doing this, but I am, the Bible says, do your good work so that they may glorify your Father in heaven, right? I'm actually that vehicle of demonstration where I'm being an example, I'm being a model of actually being able to do that so that I can actually stir other people to those good works as well. And I think that we have a responsibility to be able to be who God has called us to be. So when we talk about, being that light that shines in Babylon, I think this is one of the ways that we can do that, right? And it's not always about spending money. I was brought up, actually, one of my what somebody who mentored me, Michael Cardone Jr., would say, a problem that can be solved by money is not a problem, right? He also said creativity before capital, right? So sometimes, the government always wants to throw money at something because they think that money solves all problems, and it does not. In fact, one of the problems that we have today is that they're trying to solve problems that can be solved by money with money, right? And so I believe that we as good stewards, so it's not always about money. It's putting together, it's meeting that need, right? And some of those needs are not going to be met by money. It's going to be met by being creative. It's going to be met by being good stewards, and it's our responsibility to do that, And so as we do these things, and if we are faithful in the little things, I think God will give us more to manage. There is always a tug in me to actually get involved in politics, right? And my wife said to me, if you get involved in politics, I'm leaving you. She said that a few years ago, but she's starting to come around because she's recognizing, because good people have avoided being in the political spectrum, it has actually been taken over by people who don't necessarily care about the people. They care about themselves. And I'm not saying that I will become like that. I hope not. But so there is always that tug. But again, today God has called me to be a business person, and that's what I am. And I'm going to continue to do what He has called me to do in this space.
I understand that tug to the political. I have those same feelings sometimes, and it is, I would encourage, Christians who see a need to get involved in politics because we need good people there, right? And we are hesitant because we don't want to be labeled a politician. We don't want to be torn apart by the media. We don't want our personal life all hung out there and researched. But someone has to be willing to do that. And if Christian people are not willing, then we're abdicating our own responsibility in some regard to get involved and do our part. And so that's a very good point. And I want to go back to something else you said about stewardship. And, you said, a few minutes ago, God doesn't need our money. God doesn't really need anything we have, right? But he has called us to be good stewards. And what that makes a point to me is that by doing some of the things that we've already talked about, and I'm sure we'll talk about some more as we go along, what we're really doing, good stewarding helps us, right? It's for our benefit. It's not like God can't make it without us, and we're sitting here saying, okay, I'm going to really help God out, and he needs my help. That's really not the approach we should take. It's more coming out of an overflow of our own thanksgiving for the position that we've been put in, and then just trying to steward those well for His glory and His kingdom. And so I hope people understand that. It's not that we think we shouldn't be in a position where we think, okay, we have these resources, whether it's time or money or people or whatever it is, and now I'm really going to, help God out. It's just simply having a spirit of humility that says I can play a part in bringing God glory by doing this. And maybe you could comment or expound on that a little bit.
Yes, so I would say that God has actually limited himself to working with us as human beings, right, in meeting the needs of people, right? So, you can talk about feeding the 5,000 where God actually miraculously did that, right? But on the other hand, he may have given us resources to be able to feed 5,000. You know what I'm saying? So during the height of the pandemic, the Assembly of God Church in Sri Lanka was having a really difficult time, especially the network churches in July of last year. We paid every salary of every small church pastor as a way to be able to keep that church alive. At that time, the general superintendent of the Assemblies of God in Sri Lanka is a classmate of mine. And he said, Sam, if not for what you were doing, I'm not so sure that we would have had the pastors at the end of the summer, right? So God has limited himself, right, to that. And one other thing that I would say is when I was stone broke and I was still trusting God to get to this position, I used to pray, God allowed me to pray this way. And I used to pray, God, make me that person who owned the donkey, right? Because if you think about that story where this man owned the donkeys and Jesus said to the disciples, I want you to go and ask that man for that donkey. And if he asks you why you need it, you say that the master has need for it and he will release it, right? I used to pray saying, God, give me that. I want to have the heart of that man. Because you know what? God himself, Jesus himself did not appear to him, right? But he sent other people. But when they said, my master has need for it, right? He was able to release those resources for the master's use, right? And that is how I see myself, right? God has given me an ability, an opportunity, the blessings to be able, and the administrative skills, the favor to be able to do what I do. Right. And along with that, he's also given me the responsibility of stewardship to be able to hold these resources loosely as a way to be able to partner with him in what he's doing in this world today.
I think that's excellent. And, me personally, that's a lesson I've had to learn as I've gone through life. It's just not to hold things too tightly. When we open our hand and allow the blessings of God to flow through us, what I have personally found is that whatever that blessing is that I have been given that I then pass along in some form, the blessings I receive from that are greater, than what I have given out. And I don't necessarily mean that if I was given $1 and I passed it on that I got back $2, although God does often work that way. But the spiritual blessings, the joy, the just the contentment of seeing somebody else prosper because of God working through me has been the blessing that I have received from that. And I hope people will realize that and get out there and be doers and open their hand and be stewards of what God has given them. So very good. So we talked about your housing project, your down payment that you're helping your folks get into housing. We talked about briefly, you mentioned, helping a guy who was incarcerated come to work for you and kind of get a new start. What are there other things that you are doing that you might share with us?
Yeah, so one of the other things that I do, so the money not only to pay for houses, but some of them have school loans, college loans that they pay off by you doing that. They may not be able to pay off all of their school debt, but certainly at least some of it, right? And one of the things I did was I went out and hired a former dean of business, right, to come work for us as a consultant, and he's putting together curriculum that I can actually create pathways of development for people. I think I said in the C12 conference that I read a book called Neighborliness, and the author talks about the fact that it takes 4 things to fundamentally change society, right? It takes education, it takes a home, it takes a job, and it takes healthcare. 3 of the 4 things you get when you get a job. When you get a job, you get healthcare usually, and you have a place to live. What you don't always get with that is education. And one of the things that I am doing is putting together, development plans, where people are actually being trained, whether it's in machining, in welding, in NDT, in being able to understand tolerancing, different things like that the marketplace needs as a way to bring people along in their job so that people can actually become more valuable as they work on on their craft, right? Because if you think about it, usually as Christians, when we think about worship, we think in terms of some songs, songs that, really usher in the spirit and stuff like that. We all have some of them, don't we?
Yes.
Right? But for us, our work is also our worship. We spend more time at work than any other activity, and God actually created us for work, right? And so I have found a way to actually help people to come along in their work and to be able to become more valuable in their craft, if you will, right? And so this is again what I may be doing is not much, but on the other hand, these are little things, incremental changes that we can do to enable people to be able to come along in their lives. And not everybody is suited to go to college. So we have these pathways, even, I have this pipeline of people that I am sending through different programs as a way to be able to grow. And some of them could end up leaving me, right? So it doesn't mean that just, so it could look like this is self-serving. But the truth of the matter is, as people become more valuable, they may end up leaving me to go to other companies. But that's okay, because I'm going to be judged by how I treated them while they were working for me, right? And so I talked a little bit about my leadership motto. So my leadership motto is to create an environment where others can achieve their God-given potential, right? And for some of them, that potential might be at a different organization, but at least while they were working for me, right, I was able to have a way to be able to mold them and to enable them and give them an environment where they could achieve that potential.
Well, and I think that attitude, Sam, is borne out by the fact that that speaks to me that you have a trust in God, right? I mean, when we're not trusting God, what we tend to think is, I'm going to be careful about how I train this person because they may leave, right? And if they leave, that's going to create a problem. But if we place obedience to God's word and in caring for these people and helping them develop their own potential, and then we can trust God that, hey, if they do leave, He's got somebody else that's going to come along, right, behind them that's going to fill that void that then I may help again another person. And then that person that has moved on, they become another light shining
Yep.
in a different location. And so
Absolutely.
again, you really view those people kind of the same way as we were talking earlier. You don't want to hold them too tightly in your hand because they are just another something that God may send out from you to further your work. It's really, you still have a part in that as long as they are growing and doing the right thing.
Yep.
And one thing I really would like to see us do better, the whole entitlement culture that has developed in the United States, I have always felt kind of what you said just a minute ago, we were really created to work. We find purpose in work. We find self-value in work. We feel better about ourselves when we accomplish something. And I really think we've created in the U.S. a culture where people don't always understand that. And so some people actually need to be taught that principle before they begin to understand that learning can be fun, learning can be fulfilling. And so there's a really, to me, a base level view of things that sometimes we have to work with people to turn around. And part of that is helping them just to get down to the very basics of it, that they are created by God for a purpose.
Yep.
Right.
Yes. And I believe that you and I were at the conference where the speaker actually talked about the fact that Americans are struggling with an identity crisis. That we have an identity crisis in America today. And that is so true. And so we need to go, if we were a vehicle, we would need to go back to the original equipment manufacturer or the person who designed and built us, right, to really understand our purpose, right? And so understanding our purpose, I think, is so important. And if we would understand that we were created for a purpose, God has given us potential, and it's our responsibility to be able to seek God as a way to be able to unleash that purpose and potential, I think we will be better off.
Yes, I definitely agree. And so all that is good. One other thing I want to ask about from a cultural standpoint, and then I want to kind of hit on this, and I want to get into the book that you've written. One of the issues that we've talked about culturally is, the LGBTQ movement and some of the things that they're trying to get passed from a legislative standpoint that would impact how we do business. And obviously there's a tension between the church and that movement for very good reasons. But one of the things that you said when we were in Phoenix was that, you would welcome a member of that community into your workplace. You would welcome that opportunity to have them come work for you, which I would say is probably not what most Christian business owners are thinking. Tell me a little bit about what your thinking was behind that statement and how that would work if that happened.
Yeah, I mean, I would welcome the opportunity. I believe that the environment that I'm creating, where others can achieve their God-given potential, is also true for a member of the LGBTQ community. You know what I'm saying? So I welcome the opportunity to have somebody like that on my team. Now, I know we're not talking about the same level of diversity when I tell you that I have 4 people who are Muslims who work for me, right? And I have made sure, like this Thursday, we're having a picnic, right? Again, making sure that as I was ordering the food, normally I'm not the one who orders the food, somebody else does. But I said, hey, let's make sure that we are having a meal that is halal, to make sure that we are taking care of them. Like today, we had visitors. Every one of them were from Israel, right? And we had food made that was kosher, right? Because we wanted to make sure that we are honoring them, right? So what I would say is, and I don't want to be naive about this, but on the other hand, I would like for the environment that I'm creating to be tested by somebody of the LGBTQ community and to see whether we could still create that environment still stands as a way to be able for them to be able to achieve their God-given potential, And so I don't know what I'm in for, but I'm certainly willing to be accepted, or have that person accepted to become part of my team, and have that person, be somebody that is included, as part of a member of the team, and everything that I'm doing for everybody else, I would want to do for them as well.
Yeah, I think we get in our mind, we focus so much on differences, right? That we build these walls, whether it's between, Christianity and the LGBTQ community, or whether it's between the Muslim community or whatever, just pick a community, right? We're much better wall builders than we are wall demolition people,
Yep.
if you will. And I think we forget that if we don't build a relationship, we can't
That's right.
have any influence. We
Right.
can shout from the mountaintop, but until we come down and develop that relationship, we're not going to be able to have the influence. And so we may not be successful in influencing once we build a relationship, but we're certainly not going to have any influence if we don't build a relationship. And I think that kind of goes back to the comment of having a going on offense rather than defense.
Yep.
Being proactive in engaging people.
Yep.
And we're called to love not just the people that agree with us, the people that line up with us, but we're called to love even our enemies.
Yep.
And so that should be shown in a practical, hands-on way when it's called for.
Yep.
That's not always easy.
Yep. And the example that I will give you is, I think I told you how we got rid of the union in this company, right?
Yes.
But we still loved on the shop steward, right? Because we recognized that his role would have to change, right? The union steward's role would have to change. Him and I have a fantastic relationship today, right? And we still have a lot of love and respect for each other, even though he lost a lot because he doesn't have the union and the ability to have that influence as a union rep, right? I was able to bring him along, right? And so as long as we trust God and as we continue to do what's right, I believe that we can have win-win solutions, or win-win results.
So let's talk a little bit about your book. You've written a book entitled The First 10 Runs in Singles. And it's a book about cricket, which, immediately kind of leaves me in the dark. Being a good, American from the South, cricket's just not one of those games that we went out in the backyard and played on Saturday afternoon. But I did get the book. I took a look at it and read some of that book. And before I even started the book, I said, I'm going to go learn the basics of cricket. So I went, I looked up, what is cricket, and saw some about how the game was played so I could better understand the principles you were putting forth in the book. Tell us a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, your own experience with cricket, and what you're really trying to accomplish with the book.
So I'll start off with American football, right? So they said about Joe Parr, the Penn State football coach, he had a lot of influence on young people. And they said about Joe Parr that he used the game of football to teach the game of life. And as I thought about that, that's exactly what my father did with me, right? My father was a military officer, right? And I would say he was a better general than he was a father, in the sense that, in everything, he was an army officer first, right? Even sometimes I would have to, he would, I think, expect me to stand up and salute, right? Because he forgot when he left work and came home, kind of thing. But one of the most fondest memories that I had was from the time I was a small boy. My father actually talked to me about certain concepts that he thought would make me successful in playing cricket. So the first 10 runs in singles was one of them. The other one was watching the bowler's arm. So things like this were stuff that he taught me as a young boy. And when I used to drop catches, he would tell me, think about it this way. And so, it was a lifetime of him giving me these tidbits that I decided that as I got older, today is actually my father's 30th death anniversary. So one way that I was able to memorialize him and his life and his influence on me was to actually write a book for a lot of young people. And as I look at the world, there's a lot of people that look like me in Southeast Asia. You take India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, as these three countries, that's close to 2 billion people, right? And if you travel the world, especially if you go to the Middle East, you see a lot of people that look like me that are working in different countries in being able to take care of their families, in being able to give themselves a start. And so the reason I wrote this book was to talk to young people, as they're leaving home, they're leaving what is familiar, they're leaving a family unit, right? They're leaving their communities and having to be able into the bigger world in order to make a life for themselves. And so I wrote this book as a way to give them fundamentals about how to think about life. And so just like how football is the love language in America, right? Especially in the South, right? It is certainly the love language of the South and the love language of America. So the same way, cricket is the love language of people all over South Asia. And so I wrote it just like Jesus did, right? He took things that were familiar. He took things out of farming. He took things out of fishing, and he took things that were familiar to be able to teach people about the kingdom that he was preparing for us. So, I thought I was in good company by following that same model.
Absolutely. So I took a look at the book, and there's a couple of quotes that I want to read and then get you to speak to just a little bit. In a chapter named Picking a Side, which is talking about consistency, you have a quote in there where you ask a question and you say, do you act differently behind closed doors than you do in public? And then you make the statement that if you do, you may want to reevaluate your behavior. Expand on that one for us a little bit. What was the thinking behind that?
You definitely picked a hard one there. But what I would say is, I think that, consistency is very important, right, as a Christian, right? So my brother would say to me, don't pay attention to what he says, right? But don't listen to what he's saying, listen to what he's doing, right? So another way to say that is our action is bigger than words, right? So for us to be consistent, whether we are in public or in private, is really the challenge, right? It's very easy for us to be able to act a certain way when everybody is watching, right? It's another thing to be that consistent while we are in private, and so all I'm saying is I'm recognizing that, and I'm saying that it's all our responsibility to work on becoming more consistent, because I think that being not consistent is also extremely stressful, right? When we have to act a certain way when we are with somebody, and when we are not acting that way when we are by ourselves, that's also extremely stressful.
Yes.
And I'm certainly not saying that I'm there yet, right? I'm a work in progress, but it's definitely a challenge for all of us to be consistent in that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. That whole thing stuck out to me for a couple of reasons. One, it's really what our ministry is about, is trying to get people to be consistent and to by simply integrating their faith. And my idea was, you go to church and you see people at church and they present a certain person to you there, and what I don't want is that if you meet that person on Monday night or Saturday night, you hopefully would meet the exact same person because they're consistent in their faith. So that's one thing. And then what I have seen consistently played out in people's lives are when they start acting inconsistently, or when they find themselves being inconsistent. That should be a flag that goes up, right? Where they stop and say, okay, I'm being this way in public, but at home I'm being this way. Or, maybe when I'm traveling with work and I'm out on the road, I'm one way, but when I'm back in town where people recognize me, I'm a different way. That should raise a flag and really make people stop and evaluate, what am I doing? Because I have seen, some major problems come out of those inconsistencies. And so the point resonated with me, in the book that we should be doing that.
Yep.
The other chapter I want to just speak to a little bit was slowing the game down. And you got a quote there talking about pace. And you say there, we invest all our time and resources into our careers, our jobs, and find that we have no time left for our family and our friends. We have no time left for God. So expand on that one a little bit for us. What's your experience there, and why did you write that?
So I've always been somebody that has valued relationship, right? I don't call people just when I want something from them, right? I will call people just because I want to find out how they're doing. So many years later, many of my mentors, I still call and find out how they're doing. They're not in a position to be valuable to me anymore. But the fact that they were once useful, once made a difference in my life, I have never forgotten that. It's something that my father taught me. He was very good about that. My parents were extremely consistent about that. So they modeled that for me. And I have continued to model that. I have relationships that have gone back, so these people that I lived with for a year, whom I call mom and dad, I've gone back and honored them. In fact, when I opened up one of my companies, they came here as chief guests. And, so that is very important to me, right? At one point in my life, God actually used them to make a difference in me, right? And I like to tell people that my network will always be bigger than my net worth, right? And so to me, people are important, right? And not just because they can do something for me, but because I love people. I like being around people. I remember small things, like today, I was doing the tour just before I came in here, and I said something, and the gentleman, one of the program managers, he said, "Sam, but you would know that because you are a man of detail." Right? So my father would tell me, if you take care of the little things, the big things will take care of themselves, right? So even when I invite somebody to my home, I know who's coming, what they like, and those little things go a long way, right? And so I think we have to be careful in the way that we treat people, right? Because at the end of the day, they are made in the image of God. And, I don't like to exercise people. I don't like to use people. I would like to think that I'm somebody who likes to love people the way they want to be loved, or the way I would like to be loved.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think that's very important.
Very good. Well, I think that, the one thing you hit on there is so important. It's so easy to get lost. And, me being a business person, I know how busy life can be. There's a lot of pressure on people to get things done. And then just in general, we tend to busy ourselves, beyond the necessities of work and making a living. And I am afraid that sometimes we forget that all those activities are not really what life is about. It's about people that we meet along the way, and how we can, really speak into their lives, help them, love them, and really, show God to them, really, ultimately, right? And so, again, that was a chapter in the book that stuck out to me, just because we need to value people. And that's one of the things that I did pick up on right away when I met you first, is that Sam values people. That's just obvious, because you're pouring into people, right? You're not just doing things that make Sam look good or that make Sam more money, but you're pouring into other people and raising them up. So that's very, very good. So on the book itself, how are you using the book? I mean, you told us what the purpose was and the 2 billion people there in Asia that you're kind of had in mind when you wrote the book. How are you getting this in their hands, or how are you distributing the book, or how are you putting it to work?
Yeah, so because that part of the world is very fragmented as well, I'm actually getting the book. I've got the book translated into 6 languages, and I'm getting 2 more languages translated into. And I'm starting clubs, cricket clubs called Micah Cricket Clubs. So this year alone, the foundation that I started is going to be creating 100 cricket clubs called Micah Cricket Clubs. And it's after Micah 6:8, when the prophet Micah asked God, what does it take to please you? And then he actually answers his question by saying 3 things. He's saying, walk justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, or walk humbly, right? Walk humbly, love justice, and love mercy. So I created the Micah Cricket Club as a way to be a vehicle of demonstration, right, for people. And many of these cricket clubs are in minority communities. As I said to you, Christians are minorities all over the world. And so we are starting them in minority communities as a way to be able to build individual capital, to build social capital, and to be able to be a vehicle of demonstration of the content of the book, right? And so it's something that I'm starting, and it's not. Again, I recognize that a problem that cannot be solved by money. So I'm not throwing money at this. We are creating networks through churches, networks through youth groups, as a way to be able to start that. We are in some cases spending money, but in other cases we are bringing people along and giving them the content for free and enabling them to take that and to run with it.
Very good. So I'm sure that's going to have an impact. I've got no doubt about that. So we've got a little bit of time left. Let's talk about. I did hear you speak down in Orlando, and you talked about some of your leadership principles there, and we've touched on some of them as we've gone along here. But maybe what have we not talked about that you think is important? That people need to hear about, from a leadership standpoint and from a living out their faith standpoint.
Yeah, so let me start off with the one that is the living out standpoint. I remember talking about the fact that I lost my job because I got caught in a lie, right? And how that actually was a very difficult time in my life, because not only did I lose my job, I had to actually sign a non-compete that I would not work in the automotive aftermarket. So even though I let myself down and my own family down, I was actually able to recognize that even though I had made a mistake, right, that because of the unconditional love that my parents had shown me, that I was still loved by God unconditionally, right? And I think that's important as parents, as friends. It's for us to be able to demonstrate unconditional love is very, very important, because even when you make a mistake, we can recognize, yes, I made a mistake, but that's not who I am. That mistake doesn't define, right? Yes, I made a mistake, and I took the consequence. My one of my sons played D1 football, and one of the beautiful things that I saw when he was being recruited was I saw a safety who missed a tackle and the guy scored. When they were coming back, he had his hand up saying, "Coach, that was on me." He's telling the fans, that's on me, right? So it's important for us when we make a mistake to be able to fess up to it, to own up to it, to take responsibility for it, but recognize that God has not given up on us because of the mistake that we made, and things like redemption and reconciliation are extremely important. So that would be a lesson that I have learned because of my parents and because of my Christian faith, that in spite of the mistakes that I make, there is redemption, there is reconciliation, and there is the ability to come back, right? And so I'll talk about the ability to come back, right? So when I was a commodity broker in Sri Lanka, right, one of the major commodities that I brokered was natural rubber, right? And something about natural rubber that is important to understand is that natural rubber has very good short-term memory. If you push it down, it comes right back. That's why rubber balls are able to bounce right back. In chemistry or in seal technology, it's called short-term memory. It has, right? And so as people, it's very important for us to be able to build resilience, right? Especially with the pandemic and everything that is going on, we need to be a people who are resilient, who have the ability to come back. And we recognize that sometimes doing that by ourselves is not easy, right? But we have friends, we have family, and we have a God, right? Who's going to enable us to be able to come back, right? So the word rebound, right? There is reconciliation, there's redemption, and there is this understanding of being able to rebound from, you're like a cat, you land and you're ready to look at your next move, right? So that's important for us to do. The last thing
hold that last thought. Let me ask you a question about that, because the unconditional love part that you spoke about first, what the thought that hit me when you said that was, we forget, the Bible says that God loved us while we were yet sinners.
Yep, exactly.
It wasn't like he loved us because we were so great or we were doing all the right things. He loved us before then, right?
That's right.
Which is what he's calling us to do, is not love people after they get it all straightened out. Love them while they still have problems. Show them that requires an unconditional love sometimes.
That's
and then
right.
that leads into that reconciliation. And then ultimately we know we're going to fail, right? We're going to have problems. I mean, we're going to need to rebound, like you said, and that's going to call for more unconditional love if we're the person that's trying to bring somebody along, right? So my question is, practically, I mean, how do we do that, right? I mean, I know it's through the Holy Spirit, but maybe you can just speak to loving people unconditionally just a little bit, and then we'll move on to your other point.
Because sometimes, so I had a situation with my youngest brother, right? And what he didn't change the fact that he was still my brother, right? So we need to be able to separate what happened, right, from the relationship that we have with them, right? And I had to recognize that my brother was still my brother in spite of what happened, right? And so that enabled me to think about how I was going to be reconciled with him, right? So and I think this is one of the things that my parents showed me, right? Because whatever happened, whatever mess I came home with, I was still their son, right? The fact that I had made a mistake or dragged their name through the mud had not changed the fact that I was still their son, right? And so that enabled them to be able to love me with the capacity that was something that was God-given, right? And so I think we need to be able to define that. I said to a mentor once, I said, I thank God that he loves me in spite of who I am. And he corrected me and he said, he loves you because of who you are, right? And so the truth of the matter is, throughout, not only the sins that I've committed up to now, even the future sins that I'm going to commit that he knows about, right? He still loved me, right? And so it's something that he has done for me already. You know what I mean? It's something that I live out of. And so I need to be able to do that for somebody else. And I think that that's something that only God can actually do in our lives. And that's why as we come to know his grace and we come to know how much he has forgiven us, right, we can actually forgive other people.
Yeah, my good friend Dewey Green, he speaks of it in these terms. He says, our capacity to love other people speaks more about our connection with God than it does anything else, because we have to be connected to him in order to have that capacity to love other people, it's not something we generate in and of ourselves. It comes through our connection with him, and the capacity that he has simply flows through us to be able to extend that love to other people when maybe they don't deserve it, maybe they have made a mistake, maybe they have hurt us or wronged us or whatever the case may be. Naturally, we as humans are just not, we don't have that capacity in and of ourselves. It's really our connection to God that really enables that. So, so anyway, I cut you off earlier. You were headed to a third point.
My third point, and one of my favorites from the book, is it's called hitting on the front foot, right? So in cricket, just like in baseball, you have to take, I'm a left-hander, so I lead with right leg, right? You have to step into it, right? So that's the stroke that we're talking about. You would hit a baseball that way, where you would actually go into it. You would lean into it and hit the ball. And so that lesson from cricket, I apply to taking initiative in life, right? And I think that it's very important that in life that we take initiative. The greatest example that I can give you is when Jesus heals the person who was a paraplegic, whom the friends brought through the roof, right? Jesus was not necessarily moved by the paraplegic and his condition, but he was moved by the faith of those friends who took initiative to do what they did, right? So I think it's good for listeners and for ourselves to recognize that it's very important that sometimes, we think we are so heavenly minded that we think God is going to do everything. He has the capacity to do everything, but a lot of it is also dependent on us demonstrating faith and us taking initiative. So whether it is meeting somebody who is not like you, whether it is doing the things, random acts of kindness that God has put on your heart for you to do. And it's one of the things that I said to my younger son. Son is a little bit more reserved like my wife. And I said to him, son, the Holy Spirit is a gentleman. So when he speaks to you, right, you need to start to respond to that, right? Don't wait for him to keep saying the same thing, because if you don't respond to the little things that he's telling you, right, the big things may never come, right? So you have to be able to take initiative. So even that small voice, so how do we hear God's voice, right? God has never spoken to me audibly, right? Many people will say, thank God for that, right? But he does speak to us in a voice, and sometimes we don't know exactly what that is. And so we tend to ignore it, right? But many times it's the voice of the Spirit that is urging us, giving us that little desire to do something. It's our responsibility to take initiative and to be able to do that. Because as we do that, right, we start to have a greater capacity to be able to obey, a greater capacity to hear, and I live life to your fullest when you're doing that.
Yes, I agree. And I think throughout the Bible, if you look at different stories, the crossing of the Red Sea, they had to step forward. I think about one, when Moses was, when God was dealing with him about going back to Pharaoh, and he tells him to put his rod down, and the rod turns into a snake, and he says, okay, pick it back up. Moses had to do that. Most of us would not have wanted to pick that snake up, right? Yep. And so there is our faith is demonstrated by action, right? And yep. James tells us that in one of my favorite passages, where he talks about being doers of the word and not just hearers of the word.
Right.
We got to go out and do something to show that we have faith. It's real easy to sit back and just say we have faith.
Yep.
So anyway, Sam, I think we're getting close to the end of our time, and so I just really appreciate you joining us. I think it's been very informative. I know it's been good for me to hear again some of the stuff that you're doing and some of your thoughts and how you're living your life there. And you got any last thoughts you might want to share with us as we kind of wind down?
No, I think you got everything I got, and I thank you for I thank you for having me as well. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate it, and you keep doing what you're doing up there, and I look forward to catching up with you again sometime soon.
Yeah.
And a status update, and y'all have a blessed rest of the week up there, and we'll talk with you soon.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.